21st slide. This begins a series of 7 slides, which I think are critically important to understand why this material continues to be obfuscated, misrepresented, denied, etc. And I've called it Correcting a Doyen's Tragic Negation of Islamic Jew Hatred and Jewish Dimitude. And again, it's the first of 7 slides. Bernard Lewis, who died in 2018, died last year, made these oracular, if frankly vacuous and counterfactual summary pronouncements across 3 decades. 1974, he wrote, "The Dhimma on the whole worked well. The non-Muslims managed to thrive under Muslim rule and even to make significant contributions to Islamic civilization. The restrictions were not onerous and were usually less severe in practice than in theory. As long as the non-Muslim communities accepted and conformed to the status of tolerated subordination assigned to them, they were not troubled." 1984. "In Islamic society, hostility to the Jew is non-theological. It is not related to any specific Islamic doctrine, nor to any specific circumstance in Islamic history. For Muslims, it is not part of the birth pangs of their religion, as it is for Christians." And in 2006, Dhimmi-Tud, so it's very derisively hyphenated, "Subservience and persecution and ill treatment of Jews is a myth." 22nd slide. Shlomo Dov Goitein, who died in 1985, unlike Lewis, was a historian who specialized in the study of Muslim, non-Muslim relations. Goitein's seminal research findings were widely published, most notably in a monumental 5-volume work, which was a study of this incredible trove of primary source documents, the so-called Geniza documents, a Geniza being a synagogue's storeroom. And the documents, primarily religious, also included very important secular writings, including letters. So Goitein was the major scholar of this very important collection of documents, and they cover generally the period between 950 to 1250 CE. So the 5-volume work on these materials was called A Mediterranean Society. And it was published, but the volumes were published between 1967 and 1993. Goitein was the professor emeritus of the Hebrew University and actually a Lewis colleague while both were at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Here is Goitein from his original scholarship on the Geniza documents, writing about indigenous Muslim Jew hatred, Sinuth. In A Mediterranean Society, he observed that the Jews, quote, coined in the Geniza period, again in the mid-10th to mid-13th century, the word sinuth, quote, to differentiate animosity against Jews from the discrimination practiced by Islam against non-Muslims in general. So Jew hatred in the Jews, Muslim Jew hatred in the Jews' own coined word. And he then went on to cite how incidents of such specific Muslim Jew hatred that he documented in the Geniza record, it came from North Syria, Morocco, and Egypt, with references to Alexandria in Egypt being especially frequent. Goitein wrote many essays during this period based on the same materials, and in 1970 he wrote the following about the Dhimma covenant, or the system of dhimmitude, the non-Muslim dhimmis subjected to the Sharia, under Muslim rule. Quote, an Islamic state was part of or coincided with Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. Lands conquered by jihad, in other words. Its treasury was Mal al-Muslimin, the money of the Muslims. Christians and Jews were not citizens of the state, not even second-class citizens. They were outsiders under the protection of the Muslim state, a status characterized by the term dhimma, for which protection, again, a protection from the resumption of the jihad against them, for which protection they had to pay a poll tax specific to them. They were also exposed to a great number of discriminatory and humiliating laws. As it lies in the very nature of such restrictions, soon additional humiliations were added, and before the 2nd century of Islam was out, a complete body of legislation in this matter was in existence. In times and places in which they became too oppressive, they led to the dwindling or even complete extinction of the minorities, unquote. The 23rd slide. My research has included voluminous materials Lewis never bothered to compile, let alone analyze with comparable intellectual honesty. These careful analyses ongoing have demonstrated irrefragably that the Quran, its classical and modern exegeses by Islam's greatest commentators, and the traditions of Muhammad and the nascent Muslim community are rife with virulent conspiratorial Jew-hating motifs that have been acted upon by Muslims vis-a-vis Jews across space and time from the advent of Islam till now. The Quran's overall discussion of the Jews is marked by a litany of their sins and punishments, as if part of a divine indictment, conviction, and punishment process. Presently, Al-Azhar Quranic litanies of 20 to 25 verses describing fixed negative traits of the Jews are popular, widely disseminated, and endorsed in the writings and public statements of this Vatican of Sunni Islam's last two papal equivalents, the late Grand Imam Tantawi, current Grand Imam Al-Tayeb, and the most important modern Shiite theologian and philosopher, again, or theosopher, Tabatabai, who died in 1981. 24th slide. 17 times a day, pious Muslims repeat Quran 170, reminding them not to be like the Jews who have incurred Allah's anger. Now, the opening verse of the Quran, the so-called Fatiha, is composed of 7 very short verses. The basic arrangement of the Quran in its entirety, in the 114 chapters or surahs, from the second chapter to the 114th chapter, the organizing principle is simply longest to shortest, which leads, as you might imagine, to the rather discursive narrative of the Quran. But at any rate, Quran 1.7 refers specifically to those who've incurred Allah's anger, and the classical exegesis across 13 centuries now is that reference to those incurring Allah's anger is to the Jews. Jew-hating Quranic highlights, in addition, include Jews as prophet killers, updated in the Hadith to include Muhammad himself, allegedly poisoned to death by a Jewess in a Jewish conspiracy, while the Shiite Hadith further hold the Jews responsible for the deaths of Ali and his son Hussein, meriting permanent debasement and humiliation, Quran 261, 3:112. Chronically deceitful Jews transformed into apes or pigs, Quran 265, 560, 7:166. A Quranic epithet Muhammad personally directed at the Jews. He used brothers of apes and pigs, according to the seerah, according to the early Muslim biographies, before the Muslims subdued and he personally slaughtered by beheading all the post-pubescent males, some 700 to 900 of the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza. Jews as inveterate conspirators against Islam, the ancient Quranic antecedents of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Quran 564, who harbor the greatest enmity towards the Muslim creed, Quran 582. The Jews' ultimate sin and punishment are made clear in the Quran. They are the devil's minions, Quran 451, 460. Cursed by Allah, their faces will be obliterated, Quran 447. And if they do not accept the true faith of Islam, again, the Jews who understand their faith become Muslims, Quran 3:113, they will burn in the hellfires. And there's multiple references to this, 455, 529, 98:6, and 58:14 to 19. Slide 25. Lewis never analyzed a brilliant, scrupulously documented 75-page, 202 reference 1937 essay in French by Rabbi and Islamic scholar Georges Veta on the Hadith. I was very privileged, I felt, to have fully translated into English for the first time and included in my compendium, The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism. And this really remarkable essay demonstrated the following. Stubborn malevolence is the Jews' defining worldly characteristic in these traditions, in the Hadith. Rejecting Muhammad and refusing to convert to Islam out of jealousy, envy, and even selfish personal interest led them to acts of treachery in keeping with their inveterate nature. Sorcery, poisoning, assassination held no scruples for them. These archetypes, these themes, sanction Muslim hatred towards the Jews and the admonition to at best subject the Jews to Muslim domination as dhimmis, treated with contempt under certain humiliating arrangements. Sunni Muslim eschatology, so end of times theology, emphasizes the Jews' supreme hostility toward Islam. Jews are described as adherents of the Dajjal, the Muslim equivalent of the Antichrist, and per other traditions, the Dajjal is in fact Jewish. When the Dajjal is defeated, his Jewish companions will be slaughtered. Everything will deliver them up except for the so-called Garkad tree. Again, this is the hadith that El-Husseini referred to in his 1937 fatwa that's in the 1988 Hamas covenant. It's repeated ad nauseum, as Moshe Sharon lamented, I believe, back in 2009, almost every Friday at sermon time. Thus, according to several canonical hadith, Muhammad himself reportedly declared, if a Jew seeks refuge under a tree or a stone, these objects will be able to speak, to tell a Muslim, quote, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Veta also emphasizes how the notion of jihad, war, ransom extends into Islamic eschatology. Quote, not only are the Jews vanquished in the eschatological war, but they will serve as ransom for the Muslims in the fires of hell. The sins of certain Muslims will weigh on them like mountains, but on the day of resurrection, these sins will be lifted and laid upon the Jews. 26th slide. Lastly, a profound anti-Jewish motif, anti-Jewish and racist motif, put forth in early Muslim Sunni historiography, as well as the Shiite hadith literature, is most assuredly contra Lewis, a part of the so-called birth pangs of Islam, and that's the story of Abdullah Bin Sabah, an alleged renegade Yemenite Jew and per Sunnis founder of the heterodox Shiite sect. Sunnis held him responsible, identified as a black Jew, so again it's a racist motif as well, for promoting the Shiite heresy and fomenting the rebellion and internal strife associated with this primary breach in Islam's political innocence, culminating in the assassination of the third rightly guided Caliph Uthman, and the bitter, lasting legacy of Sunni Shiite sectarian strife. Authoritative Shiite authors claim this identifiably black Jew was guilty of perverting and warping the message of Caliph Ali's true Shiite followers. Mainstream Shiites thus designated Abdullah bin Sabah as an avatar of extreme heretical beliefs for which Caliph Ali purportedly had Ibn Sabah burned alive, as described in Shiite hadith. 27th slide. So, in summary, the entirety of this ugly Islamic doctrine, shared with minimal variation by Sunni and Shiite Islam alike, begot chronic grinding oppression, interspersed with paroxysms of violence, including sporadic mass murderous pogroms, which affected Jewish communities in Palestine, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and even mythically tolerant Muslim Spain to the west, as well as Turkey to the north, and Iraq and Iran to the east. Modern Zionism, culminating in the reestablishment of Israel, governed by Jews fully liberated from 13 centuries of jihad-imposed dhimmitude in their ancestral homeland, has reinvigorated Islam's annihilationist strains of Jew hatred. Very interesting review of the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism. My compendium was written by historian Robert E. Kaplan, who's a Cornell-educated historian and has taught in Israel, and whose real expertise is in anti-Semitism generally, but particularly European anti-Semitism. This remarkable review documented 4 generalizations Bernard Lewis employed to negate Islamic anti-Semitism, which, as Kaplan wrote, quote, crumble under the slightest scrutiny. And these are Kaplan's summary observations. The least onerous version of Muslim oppression is typical of Muslim practice. The worst behavior of Christians towards Jews was the norm, that Muslim abuses were far less bad than the worst imaginable abuses by non-Muslims. ascribing to human nature rather than Islam, with no basis of evidence, the unattractive characteristics exhibited by Muslims. So again, these are the generalizations Kaplan observed Lewis employing to negate Islamic anti-Semitism. But Kaplan further identified Lewis's cynical manipulation of semantics. Quoting Kaplan, how does Lewis reach the conclusion that anti-Semitism is unknown to classical Islam? He defines anti-Semitism as hatred of Jews according to Christian doctrine, not simply hatred of Jews. In doing so, he distorts the ordinary meaning of anti-Semitism, which in contemporary English means hatred of Jews. And I've added a postscript on these observations, which occurred during the discussion section of my presentation on July 30th, 2019 at the ZOA. And it's a revelation that Mort Klein courageously made public. And it has to do with Lewis's being enamored of the Oslo process and being really an Oslo enforcer, which may strike some people as odd that he even would abide the Oslo process. But at any rate, when you begin to see this apologetic that I've outlined, it actually becomes quite understandable. And so ZOA President Mort Klein revealed that within 6 months after the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords, which Professor Lewis vociferously championed, Mr. Klein received a threatening phone call from the good professor that Klein ZOA must stop chronicling and reporting the Arafat-led Palestinian Muslim regime's violation of the Accords, which of course ultimately included incitement of and participation in acts of murderous jihad violence against Israeli Jews. So I add that as a postscript to the discussion.